All right. Well, shall we get started with some of the content, and then
Sure.
we'll take it from there. And so I have prepared some slides, and it's really it's a conceptual perspective that is at the same time a kind of a critical perspective on the construct of international, and yet will be most helpful to me is to hear a little bit from you at the very beginning, and then I'll tailor the slides accordingly to what we discuss. But let me start with the sharing of the screen, and then we'll quickly get to the question that I have for you all, and then I'll offer some ideas, and then let's see what those ideas take us. And I would prefer to have as much interaction as possible, but also recognize that people are busy, and sometimes they'd rather just have content and make the reflections on their own. And but let me start with the share on my screen, and hopefully this will work. And so let me see.
Sure. And then right before I'll go ahead and just introduce you a little bit more formally, and then we can.
All right. Yeah,
start
I was
it,
just gonna do
like,
that, but yes, if you wanted to, please.
Sure. Yeah, I'm excited to have Dr. Andrés Consoli here from UC Santa Barbara. So I'm an undergraduate, graduated from UC Santa Barbara and worked at UC Santa Barbara for a couple of years in the Office of Admissions. So I had seen him before, and then I've been meaning to talk with him and invite him to one of these, and I'm glad we're finally able to have him. But Andrés, Dr. Consoli, is associate professor in the Department of Counseling, Clinical, and School Psychology. I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he received his licenciatura degree in clinical psychology at the Universidad de Belgrano, and earned a master's and doctorate in counseling psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and received doctoral training in behavioral medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. Prior to UC Santa Barbara, Andrés was a professor and associate chair of the Department of Counseling, College of Health and Social Sciences at San Francisco State University, and a visiting professor at the Universidad de Valle in Guatemala, and in the master's and doctoral programs, and a licensed psychologist in California. Among other services and other, Andrés has served as president of the National Latino-Latina Psychological Association, as a member at large at APA's Division 52, International Psychology, as president of the American Society of Psychology, and as president of Western Association of Counselor Education and Supervision. The list goes on, and I don't want to take too much time from Dr. Consoli, but I'm very excited to have you here. And with that, we can take the floor.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Armando. Really, no need. We're among colleagues, and so I appreciate your kind words. And as you can gather from what Armando shared, I am very interested in leadership, and I'm quite proud of my engagement as a leader. And in terms of your group, I don't know if you use the entire acronym or how you pronounce it, but UREAG, or so. But really, issues of underrepresentation are very dear to me. So when you look at all the presidencies I've done, that's been my concern. And obviously, international engagement, it's a primary concern of mine. I am, formerly undocumented immigrant from Argentina, and therefore the plight and the cause of people whose immigration status in certain contexts at certain times is a bit tenuous, and in fact untenable at times. And we're seeing it right now with the Haitian refugees seeking asylum at the border with the United States. We saw it before, and we continue to see it with family separation. All these matters are very important to me, and therefore, as we think of international education and underrepresentation in that context, or these are very are critical and crucial topics to entertain. So I want to thank you, Armando, for inviting me. The remarks that I have prepared are kind of captured in the title in terms of this international engagement, pluralism, and learning partnerships, which the title in and of itself kind of reveals my hand on my values, if you will. And we'll get to those as we go through the presentation. My pronouns are he, him, él. The él signifies bilingual in English and Spanish. And I am currently working at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm very fortunate that I have my home department is counseling, clinical, and school psych, but I have, different appointments throughout the university because of, again, my international interest. One is with the Spanish and Portuguese department. The other one is with the Chicanx department. And the other one, it's a really unusual context, which is a Latin American and Iberian studies. And I'm very interested in that understanding of our history, the roots, the indigenous roots, and also the colonizing roots that characterize Latin America. So here at UCSB, we're on Chumash land, and they recognize themselves as custodians. They're not owners of any land, nobody is, and therefore I want to pay tribute to the Chumash band of Indians, and recognize too that UCSB has usurped that land, and it's actually on sacred grounds. Parts of our campus cannot be paved over because those are burial grounds, documented burial grounds, and people complain about why isn't this paved? Well, it's good to know your history in order to understand why it isn't paved. Although, again, we're occupiers, and the plight of, again, the Chumash band of Indians, but also others in different locations, including where you all are, is the idea to, okay, nobody's against education. In fact, our Chumash fellows and leaders have made that very clear, that they're not against education. They're for education, but also they are for education that is with them, not without them. And we have a really embarrassing record when it comes to with. A very little representation and inclusion, because it's not just representation, but inclusion in terms of the mission of the university and how inclusive it is, and how it concerns itself with matters that are pertinent to Chumash custodians. My current leadership position is I'm Vice President for International Affairs of Division 17, which is counseling psychology. So some of the examples I'm going to offer as we go through the presentation today will be in terms of this idea of counseling psychology, or the discipline of counseling psychology. So, and let me see if I can rearrange my screen a little bit so I can see you all as much as possible. Okay, and so there is an acknowledgement there, a welcoming. It's a little bit after 8 in the morning here, so and I use both language, English and Spanish, to greet you. Although I know we have person up in Hawaii, so that's commendable. Somebody got up that early, yeah, but, for this. So bear with you. I hope you know. I typically drink mate from Argentina, and I don't know if you drink coffee or whatever. It keeps you awake. I, I, I won't be offering caffeine. Hopefully, I will be offering some reflection. So, but let me start with the first slide, and I am very curious when you hear this construct of international engagement, which I'm sure is at the heart of what you may, define within your group, but also within the larger organization about international education. But I use this expression international engagement. But before I tell you what I think it is, I'm very curious of how would you define it? So clearly you're a member of an organization that has international as a term within its flagship name. Obviously, the underrepresentation is what characterizes this group. But I'm again very curious when you hear the terms international engagement, but even starting with international within the organization that you're part of, how would you define it? What are the things that come to mind for you? And everything and anything, it's okay, So I welcome any and every input. And I have my notepad next to me, so I like to jot down some notes as well. So I hope you don't mind that I'll do that as we go. But again, how do you understand those terms, international and then engagement, and then the two of them combined? How would you define it? What reactions you have to those terms? So let me hear you out. And not everybody at once, please, because we can't hear each other. But
well, sure. I certainly was not planning to participate so actively, but I will do my best. So my entire job, I think, is about international engagement. So what I do is I work with partner universities, but also organizations, sometimes people like recruitment agents across the globe to collaborate. When we work with university partners, the idea is about finding ways to collaborate that are beneficial to both institutions and, of course, the students at those institutions. And so I think when I think of engagement, at least in the role that I play, the biggest word that I can think of is collaboration.
Yeah, wonderful, Christina. I so appreciate it. I love music to my ears, the things you're saying in terms of that is mutually beneficial. And so that, as you probably saw in the title of the presentation, about learning partnerships, you kind of got to the end of my presentation. So I love what you just articulated. Thank you so much for doing it so eloquently. Clearly, you're a few hours ahead of us, so you're bright and awake. Although one of the things that happens in international engagement, like yesterday, I started at 7 in the morning because I collaborate on a research project with colleagues in Barcelona who are 9 hours ahead of me. So they're in the middle of the afternoon and here is 7 a.m. So wonderful, Christina. Thank you so much for being so generous with what you share. And how about others? Other thoughts as you hear this, international engagement and and Christina says, yes, I'm regularly on the phone at strange times, indeed. All right, let me hear from others. Armando, you wanted to say something.
Yes, I think first of all, this is a great example of international engagement. I'm actually in Mexico at this moment. So just a month ago I was in Brazil, and for the same reasons, I think international engagement is this dialogue among humans around the world, right? The sharing of ideas, conversation, breaking down, describing your reality to others, and having that exchange. And I think that's a huge part of this dialogue, and again, sharing stories, like you said, histories, everything. I think that's key. to engaging internationally is to reach out to folks and listen.
Wonderful. And as you know, a psychologist, listening, which is again this construct that you kindly offered, is crucial. And this idea of active listening, which could look very different according to the cultural context you're in. In Argentina, I'm going to be using some soccer metaphors because, again, it is my background. But if you watch a game and there's two people present, you're going to have three opinions because people are going to disagree with themselves. So it's like, gosh, how is it? But that's the kind of active listening that it could characterize certain cultural contexts with certain topics. In others, it's much more reflective. It's much more so, and many times it's simultaneous. One of the things that really struck me when I came to the United States is that people wait turns to talk. Well, what is this? I mean, it's like, this is boring. You know, where is the chaos that characterize, you know? I grew up in an Italian immigrant family. Sunday for pasta at 1 p.m., not at noon, will be 50 people at the table. So it will be chaotic, you know, it'll be eating and yelling and, you know, so a marriage proposal in the middle of it, and people at the end of the table missed it. Yeah, it was happening. You didn't miss it. And so then it went down the table that, yeah, somebody got proposed. So anyhow, so I came from that chaos, as it was then defined to me. Well, that's chaotic, to a very proper one at a time, raise your hand kind of thing, which was so. Again, as you think of international engagement, the differences and the diversity of ways of engaging and that listening that you so nicely pointed out, Armando, is crucial. So, all right, what else? How would you define it? I don't know if, Pavan, you're able to share and
Sure. Sure. I think international engagement is something I'm very passionate about, in the sense I do study abroad. So I have taken students from here to Paris, India, Peru, and even do faculty exchange. I was once an international student in this country before becoming an associate professor. So the challenges an international student face, including the example you gave about waiting your turn to talk, food, culture, everything becomes challenging on a regular basis. So at CIES, when I first came, it's a huge conference, and where do you find your home within this big conference? So one thing I'm passionate about is welcoming students, faculty members, or scholars from all different background, and making that safe space for them to talk, take them out for dinner or meet them for lunch. I'm very passionate about that. I even create some webinars and platform for international students within campus too, the previous campus and the campus I'm working with. So that's something I'm very proud of, and I enjoy doing that.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. And I think your child got my point about simultaneous contributions. I love it. And although I couldn't fully understand your child, but I certainly heard you well, and how much a role that has played in your professional day-to-day experience. So, and I agree in terms of exchanges, in terms of, again, taking the risk of going overseas and going with students overseas, and how transformative that experience can be. And I would say, for sure, as an immigrant, that has been a major, major issue. I did not know how Argentine I was. In fact, how porteño, I grew up in Buenos Aires, it's a port, so porteño is derivation from port. I didn't know how porteño I was until I came to the United States. And Marshall McLuhan had that offers or uses the expression, you know, it is a cinch that fish didn't discover water. I didn't know the water I swam until I was out of that water and came to the United States, and I got confronted with my history as having grown up in a military dictatorship, my history of gender issues, ways of relating to others based on gender. In fact, nowadays I introduce myself as a recovering prejudiced because I was taught to hate. And that has taken a lifelong, and it's not going to end. It keeps showing up in ways that, like, oh my gosh, I thought I worked on that, but not yet, or not to a point of satisfaction. And I get confronted on things on a regular basis about those challenges. So it's that experience it's crucial and really confronts us on a regular basis. So so I'm just reading Pavancia Country. So Urea has always also been taking a holistic approach when it comes to reviewing conference proposal from international scholars and organizations. Wonderful, yes. And what a challenge, you know, to embrace a holistic stance. So I so appreciate that commitment. So wonderful. And Yabe, or I know Susan, I don't know if you want to participate too, or anybody else. I know it may be a bit difficult sometimes to do. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
I actually didn't have, like, you know, much understanding of what international engagement, but, you know, as I, you know, heard other, you know, people's input, like what I can think of is that I am working in a like working with international students a lot in my current job, and like having them, you know, come here and study, but at the same time, like having them like empower themselves to be to be a global citizen here, is a part of my job. So that's what I kind of thought of, but then not a concrete, you know, understanding on the subject.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good understanding and accompanying the journey of international students in their engagement. And I love the way you said it in terms of, you know, global citizens, recognizing ourselves, you know, beyond, not just beyond, but actually recognizing our groundings, and then how that grounding can help us reach and establish bridges of shared understanding and collaboration. I think that you said it quite well. So I think, Susan, you were about to say something too, as Yabe was starting, but I don't know if you want to contribute. I think she unmuted. All right. Well, so let me go on to offer a puzzling set of circumstances that led to this. We were working on a chapter which I thought, okay, we're going to describe certain things, but then it dawned on us that as we read the literature, there was very little on taxonomies about international engagement. So, you know, in a moment of in a cavalier moment, and perhaps I said, well, why don't we come up with our own taxonomy as to what international engagement might be? And puzzling enough, this is what this chapter has become known for, of taking the risk of putting a possible taxonomy. And so it's going to sound a little bit abstract, but then I'm going to make it really concrete to make sense of it. But these are the three terms that the co-authors and I came up with. And we borrow shamelessly, perhaps, from other expressions, and as you can probably tell there, from the ism in the first one, internationalism, to the more action-oriented internationalization, to then revealing our values, international pluralism. And so those are the three terms that I'm going to introduce as part of the conceptual underpinnings of this presentation as a taxonomy. It's a possible taxonomy. Like every taxonomy, it can fall by its own weight. I mean, in botany, you may remember back in the 1800s, they created this taxonomy that has so many different characteristics that then every characteristic became its own category. So we can't really have so many characteristics because then it falls apart by its own weight. So it is a very modest taxonomy. There's only 3 entries there, and I'm going to walk you through each of those. There's nothing that you're not going to be familiar with there. It's just a way of organizing the, if you will, the evolution of our understanding, at least from a Western world perspective, starting with internationalism, then getting to internationalization, and ultimately, what could be characterized contemporarily as international pluralism. And I think Christina already got there. Again, with this idea, of ways to collaborate, which is really what international pluralism gets at, compare and contrast it to internationalism. And I think, Pavan, you mentioned that you took students, I think you mentioned to Peru, and Peru is a really good example of internationalism. Not Peru itself, but really the relationship that Spain established with its colonies. Not even colonies at the very beginning, invasion, if you will, may characterize that better. And so let me go into each one. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see the reference. And so I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues. Mary Bullock, for many, many years, she was the director of the Office of International Affairs at APA. Melissa, who's also a faculty member here, a collaborator, and then myself. And this is what the chapter is. It's in a well-established handbook, and that unlike other handbooks where you have multiple editions, each edition of this handbook is completely different. They don't repeat any authors. The editors may be somewhat repeated, but really the contributors are completely different in every edition. So, and we're not going to get a chance to participate in the next edition because the idea is, okay, let's get different authors and make each edition its own, rather than, revise that chapter and then, the revisions are minimal. So I love this particular handbook. So we started with this first category that we call internationalism. And it's characterized by a pretty crude way of colonization, basically. But the way, because we're counseling psychologists at heart, the way we wanted to do this, it was looking at, okay, what are the positive things that each of the definition can have, or each of the taxonomy may have, but then let's criticize it as well. So we're going to start with internationalism, which is characterized by what you see on the screen: going abroad, to export what? A particular way of engaging in a given discipline. In my case, it's counseling and psychology altogether, if you will, but I'm going to go abroad and bring with me something that this country may or may not have. What we have learned is, especially through colonization, is that the country had it all along. It's just they call it something very different. It's like language. Almost every country in the world has its own distinct language. When the Spaniards came, there was a language here. There were, and here I mean, because I'm in America's, I'm plural on purpose, although I should use a different term because that's not what was known for. And it wasn't the Indias either, as Columbus thought. And anyhow, the idea again is, as we engage internationally, we're going to bring some knowledge with us. That knowledge from a positive or favorable perspective merits recognition. And in fact, I obviously, as you all read a lot about this topic, but the example I always resort to, it's not something that it's in a book, but it's actually in a movie. And I don't know if any of you have seen is the hug of the serpent, El abrazo de la serpiente. Anybody has seen Hug of the Serpent? I highly recommend it. It has a little segment. I thought I would show it to you, but it takes a little while to capture it. But it's basically the story of an anthropologist that goes from Germany to some jungles in Peru and nearby in the Amazons. The Amazon, as you know, starts in Peru. The Amazon River starts in Peru and goes all the way through Brazil. And he accompanies a group of it's interesting. I don't know if you have reflected or are aware, but the term Aborigine is the most insultive term that you can think of, because, as you know, Aborigine means without origin. So abnormal, like we say, is the lack of normality. Aborigine is the lack of origin, and that's again the most insulted term. So to try to overcome that, in Spanish nowadays we say pueblos originarios. So the groups of people who are the original people of the land. So he is interacting with this, original people of the land. And at the end of a certain scene, the anthropologist is leaving. And the shaman that has been accompanying him is staying. And as he's leaving, he's looking for his compass. And he can't find it. And he starts to get really upset because, okay, where is my compass? Because the idea was, I don't want to influence in any way, shape, or form the existing knowledge of ways of orienting themselves. And they use the stars, they use other ways of orienting themselves, not a compass. And so he gets very upset. And where is it? I'm going to pollute your way. You're going to lose your ways. And the shaman says to him, much more eloquent than I'll be able to say it, but you're so dumb. You think that you own knowledge? All knowledge is there to be given, you know, and that's unfortunate. I mean, that's a powerful statement, but it's an unfortunate way. Oh, I'm going to preserve. I'm not going to. International engagement is all about exchanges. It's all about respecting each other. That you have something. So when we think of going abroad to export something, to the extent that it's not colonization, which basically devalues what's there, it can actually be helpful. Starting with a vaccine. You know, we're in the midst of a pandemic, starting with a vaccine. If a country has all that power and knowledge and abilities, and it can save people from polio to begin with, why not? Now, let's do it in a way that is affirmative, emancipatory, that it takes into account the different conditions in different countries, for sure. But at its extreme, so that's the favorable understanding of internationalism. At its extreme is when it's oppressive. It is like one thing that is happening in my midst today is, and I think this is helpful in light of your concern as a group of underrepresentation. It's like, I have colleagues who are going into settings like, say, school, to address bullying with tools that, first and foremost, it's not recognized what bullying looks like. Bullying has been happening all along. There are different ways of bullying depending on your ethnic group or your racial group. But most important, there are different ways in which people have coped, appropriately coped, resolved, and there's not just one way of resolving. And later on, if we have time, I'm going to give you some examples. And one example is the intervention following the tsunami in Indonesia, where people came from internationalism perspective. We're going to teach people how to mourn. And so that's what is called the second tsunami. First is the tsunami, the so-called natural phenomenon. And then is the human-made disaster, when we all, as Western professionals with good intentions, again, road to hell is paved with good intention, no offense meant by that, but that those well intentions went awry because they were not respectful of people's ways of coping with loss, and impose a mourning process that was not culturally congruent. And that's internationalism as it works. Let me pause there. Does that make sense? Questions about it? That's the first in the taxonomy. And historically, that's where we started. So when the Spaniards bring to the Americas the verb, they brought their own values, beliefs, attitudes, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And, you know, they impose, they use their power to impose. But any questions so far? Does that first category make sense? That, yeah? Okay, wonderful. I see lots of head noddings. So let me go to the second one. Well, this is, if you will, again, the taxonomy is intended as an evolution. So we learn from those failures. We also learn from some of the positive things. That, my gosh, you know, we got to recognize that science and practice can take different forms across nations and cultures. Yeah. So let's recognize that. Let's celebrate that each country we go to, or each country that comes to us, has their own ways of engaging with ways of deriving knowledge, science, and then how to carry out that knowledge, practice, yeah? And that's wonderful, except it does not recognize power differentials. And so that's the internationalization. we're going to recognize that different people do differently. And again, that's great. And then we create these taxonomies that recognize, well, these people do it this way, that people do it that way, that people. The problem is it puts everybody into the same box. And when you say Argentines, blah, 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 it's like, oh my gosh, you had no idea what you're talking about. Because yes, it's one country, but it's extremely diverse, you know, and there are different ways of going about it, you know. Yes, you can stereotype about certain things, but the reality is there are significant differences. So it's not as homogeneous as internationalization makes it look like. The diversity within is what's missed, yeah? And then it becomes shorthand for, like, you know, some of the things that in fact, some of the books that CIA puts out. Well, you're going to this country, let me break it down for you. This is the way they greet, this is the way they do things. It's like, oh my gosh, that's the way to do it in Mexico City, but you go to Querétaro or you go to Guadalajara, it could be completely different, you know, man. That, well, are you from the DF or are you? It's like, so it has its pros as its cons, and that's what I'm trying to highlight on this one. But questions about this one, this stage, does that make sense? Or okay, and then I'm going to go to the last one, and this one is international pluralism. And of course, this is where we're showing our values. This is where we think. So an internationalization is a recognition of differences. What international pluralism brings is the coexistence of those differences. And that's the big difference, if you will. That is, again, the coexistence of those differences. They don't sit apart, they actually coexist. And a good example of this is Tex-Mex. You know, it's an interesting blending, and culture is always alive. One of the things that I'm working on is looking at Latinx values, because they got stereotyped. And some of the values that people say, like Marianismo, it's like, hold on a second, this is very religiously associated. It does remind me of the colony. It reminds me of the colonizer, and so on and so forth. So international pluralism, international engagement that crosses national boundaries, that it's characterized by mutuality and reciprocity among partners. And the hallmark of that is learning partnerships. Meaning what? The learning, just as Christina said before, is mutual. It goes both ways. It's not, I show you, I teach you, I show you, I know. Is you have something important, I have something important, let's share with each other. And give ourselves the opportunity to be mutually transformed by this international engagement, by this international exchange. I recognize myself as your student, and you recognize yourself as my student. And then we both are going to grow and be transformed by the exchange. So I see Armando saying, I'm in Guadalajara, very big difference, yes. And let's not talk about tacos, because everybody does it differently, you know, so, but, so again, in this international pluralism, we recognize those differences, but we recognize the value of what each of us can contribute. And most important in this whole perspective is that there will be mutual transformation. That requires humility and requires openness. One of my main concerns that I see in international engagement is something that I got exposed really early on when I came from Argentina. The first place I went to was with a bunch of Argentine friends that I knew from when I was back in Argentina. So I went, I stayed there for a week, and I'm like, what the heck am I doing? This looks exactly like, it's like I never left. And it's like, okay, I'm moving out. Sorry, I got nothing with you, but against you, I'm moving out. And that's when I really started to feel like I have really left Argentina and gone elsewhere. And part of the problem sometimes that I've seen, particularly in education abroad programs, is you get a cluster of people that move together. I love the international programs that actually require for people to live with a family, that, you know, it's a local family and speak only the language they're speaking in that particular country, et cetera, et cetera. So that creates mutuality, creates opportunities for learning partnerships. It creates opportunities for what we call cultural immersion, which is not exclusive a language immersion. It's about traditions, it's about perspectives, and on and on and on. So, okay, let me pause here. I'm also mindful of the time, and I have a lot more slides to go through, but this, I kind of jump ahead with some of the comments that I share, but let me pause here and let me see, you know, your reactions to the taxonomy that I'm proposing, my colleagues and I are proposing, but your thoughts, your comments, ways it makes sense to you, or ways in which you would improve it or you would add. So let me turn it to you and see what your thoughts are.
I'll just say that for me, one of the challenges is, you know, this idea of reciprocity and mutual mutual benefit is that particularly in higher education, you have competing priorities. And so the Office of International Education certainly has certain priorities about what's important, right? And so, you know, that kind of exchange, providing our domestic students who, you know, even though large numbers of our students here at St. John's do study abroad compared to the national averages, still a really small number of students. So we recognize that by bringing folks into our community, that our students who don't ever leave the country are having a richer experience, all of those things. Of course, there are lots of people here who are very concerned about the cost of these things, who see the opportunity for us to make money off of these kinds of collaborations. And so there's always that tension. So there's the piece for me that's like, yes, that's what this international pluralism is. And then it's in like the operationalizing of these kinds of projects where you start to say like, well, I don't want to compromise that mutual, you know, benefit. And yet I also have to meet certain expectations and just needs, right? Like we can't afford to send everybody abroad, et cetera. So that's where there's some tension, I think.
Yeah, so powerful, Christina. I hear you. And the instrumentation, the devil is in the details. Yes, the instrumentation and convincing, especially bureaucratic systems, you know, that put like a bureaucracy. It puts protocol and performative ahead of content, and it is quite painful. And I hear you, and I've been there in so many ways, and especially interpreting transcripts from other countries to, you know, to what it looks like here. It's like, oh my gosh. So yes, I hear you loud and clear. Thank you for sharing that. The one thing I'll say, I've been a visiting professor in Guatemala for 2 decades. We created a master's program, a doctoral program. Armando hinted at that earlier on when he was introducing me. The one thing that it was striking to me when I got there is the dynamic from the other side. You know, you tell us. I'm like, no, I'm here to be your partner. I'm here to partner with you. And they didn't believe me at the beginning. And I said, I'm here for the long term. 20 years later, I'm here for the long term. We've done all kinds of master's program, doctoral program, a special issue in a journal. Anyway, on and on and on. It takes a while for people to really rise up to the occasion in both ends, on my end and their end, and to see that they have something valuable to share, and something valuable to learn, and then co-create. Because the beauty of it is what we create, nobody owns. If I didn't do it, they didn't do it, we did it. And that's the construct of Martin Buber's the I-thou relationship, how we can do something that nobody is the owner of, it transcends us. And that's what, again, this idea of international pluralism is about. But other thoughts, thank you, Christina, I appreciate what you share. Other thoughts or other reactions to the taxonomy, or ways in which you have conceptualized it yourselves, or?
Yes, I think we definitely covered on a lot of topics, and one thing that just from experience being in different countries, just in the past year, I was in Brazil for the past 6 months, and then before that I was in Mexico also for the entire year, and then before that in the US, and I'm still working in university context, and so different times, different I think cultures. I think one of the main things is I think the local culture, the cultural context, I think is very important. And a lot of the times we're in spaces where where we still operate under the dominant culture of the Western, like you said, I pause, you pause, and all of that. But also validating, for example, your experience, Andrés, for Latinos, of having this chaos and missing that chaos a lot of the times, and in doing so, we kind of silence a part of our own identity. So and this happens around the world, internationally, where the US, everybody has to speak English, everybody has to be on the dot, on the hour, and I at least being in Mexico and being in Brazil, I see value to not being always on time, and starting meetings by just talking about what happened on the weekend, talking about another colleague's family members, things like that at least in the dominant culture we don't see a lot. And as a Latino myself, and valuing and living in that cultural context, I see the value, I see the importance of it. And whenever I'm in meetings, international meetings, there's folks from all over the place. I know that there's folks that are kind of suppressing a little bit of the identity whenever they start a conversation. And I think that's important to recognize, and because a lot of the times it's folks from other countries that don't identify with the dominant culture that are quieting their voice, that are kind of suppressing certain things, and folks from the dominant culture are that is their culture. They're always going to be in a kind of a like a higher,
Yes.
standing there. And as you mentioned, it needs to be very horizontal, to create the language equally. But if we're creating knowledge in English only, if we're only having these dialogues in English, and so I think is having that. First of all, I think is that understanding, or at least for it to be explicit, to have at least having these conversations about those different inequities there, and then having a dialogue, or sharing the space. Maybe in a half of the meeting, maybe we start in a different language, or something like that, and that's going to make folks maybe they don't know the language, but again, it starts tilting the thing. So maybe doing things like that, starting to share a little bit of that cultural space, I guess, and allowing for that a little bit more within more formal meetings, I think is important as well. And it kind of equalizes things a little bit to be able to share, and to create knowledge a little more equitably.
Yeah, and I know we're out of time, and I know people need to go elsewhere, and yet I fully agree with what you're saying. It's just that we live in asymmetrical worlds. Spanish in the United States has not the reputation that German or French or others may have, and therefore it is asymmetrical. It's hard to really engage in horizontally when that's headwind, if you will. So, and as you engage abroad, English has a certain reputation, and therefore it creates all kinds of dynamics, if you will. So, all right. Well, thank you again for the invitation. I know people need to run, and I know parents need to attend to the children around them. And so thank you again for the invitation. Armando, I'll send you the chapter in case people want to take a look at it in context and get a more detailed understanding of that taxonomy. But also, I'm happy to engage. Any of you, need to email me. I'm happy to be available, and so just let me know how I can be of help.
In the chat, if you can maybe include in the chat, and we can
sure
share from there.
Yeah.
This was great. Thank you so much for joining. And I was about to talk, and I didn't even look at the time. Sometimes I feel like I don't know if I have a few minutes. So people, if they want to jump out, feel free to jump out. I was going to say, even though I did study abroad, I feel sometimes when we take students from here to foreign countries, I took students to India, they become a tourist. When we take them in a boat, show them, oh, those are kids, those are these things, walk around and leave away. And I work with children with special needs, and they worked with schools, but the thing is there was no continuity. I did it twice and we were not able to go back, funding reasons, different reasons. So what does it do? Are we becoming a tourist? Is it like going to a zoo or somewhere else, or are we making any difference? So I'll shut my mouth, but thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so powerful. I thank you so much for your contribution there. It how to engage the gaze without feeling like you're looking through a glass, which is sometimes what the tourist experience is. There's kind of going, where in fact sometimes immersing yourself is a much more interesting journey. At times, not always has to be that way, but at times the depth of the exchange can be crucial, because that's where transformation can happen. Otherwise, you're just seeing through the gaze that you brought, but your gaze doesn't change by the experience. So thank you. So that was a wonderful example, Pavan. I appreciate it. And painful too, because that's, as we witness it, it's like, oh my gosh, you have no idea what you're missing. But it is what it is. So, and sometimes bureaucracy, like Christina was saying earlier, can get in the way of that.
Please do submit a proposal for the upcoming CIES conference under UREAC. We would love to hear more about these topics too. Please, we would love to have you.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah,
we even have traveling grant. Armando will fill you with all those information.
Wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. I think next year is going to be in Minneapolis, I believe, but it's going to be hybrid, so there's option to be online as well if you prefer. But we definitely would like to hopefully see folks in person, but we'll see. We'll see next year.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you again, Andrés. Thank you, Pavan. Thank you, Christina, Yabe, and Susan, for this great session. Definitely tune in for the next sessions that we'll have in the upcoming months, and hopefully we can maybe meet in the conference that's coming up next year to continue these conversations.